You were never choosing words to describe reality, you were letting inherited language choose reality for you. Every sentence you repeat tightens a loop around identity, turning possibility into habit while you call it truth. The moment you stop speaking automatically, a fracture opens where awareness can step through. This is not about control, it is about authorship returning to its rightful place. Stay here, because what comes next decides whether the voice in your head remains borrowed or finally becomes yours. You notice the voice inside you begin speaking before any choice is made, as if the sentence arrives already formed while awareness is still inhaling. A faint pressure gathers in the chest when the words land, because they feel familiar yet strangely imposed, like hearing yourself speak from a step behind your own breath. Language here is not a neutral tool but the first filter reality passes through, deciding what becomes visible and what dissolves before reaching you. The mind settles into the phrasing the way lungs settle into a habitual rhythm, repeating without asking who set the pace. If the words arrive before the choice, who exactly is choosing the reality you feel yourself living inside? In ordinary moments you catch yourself narrating experience automatically, labeling events as problems or delays before sensation has time to breathe. There is tension in noticing how quickly meaning clamps down, because once the word is spoken internally, emotion follows it like a trained response. Words act less like descriptions and more like switches, selecting which signals the nervous system amplifies and which it ignores. The echo of those labels hums quietly in the background, guiding posture, tone, and expectation without needing further instruction. This is how perception stabilizes into a predictable pattern rather than a field of open possibilities. You sit at a table with a phone or a bill or a contract in front of you, and a sentence forms inside before your eyes finish scanning the page. A subtle tightening in the jaw accompanies the phrasing, because the words already imply outcome, effort, or defeat before action begins. Language operates as an internal operating system, prioritizing certain interpretations and closing others before conscious evaluation ever starts. The body recognizes the script and adjusts breath and attention to match it, rehearsing the same emotional choreography again. What if the moment you name the situation, you have already decided how it must end? At work, in conversation, or alone in transit, you feel how the same vocabulary keeps reappearing like a reflection you cannot step away from. There is discomfort in realizing that this mirror is not passive, because it feeds back into behavior, narrowing choices to what fits the words already in use. When language frames experience first, reality becomes less something you meet and more something you confirm. The mind relaxes into the familiar loop, mistaking repetition for truth and familiarity for accuracy. This is the quiet mechanism by which days begin to resemble each other without resistance. Late in the day you replay a moment and notice the sentence that defined it still lingering, shaping memory more than the event itself. A soft unease surfaces because you see that experience did not speak first, the words did, and sensation followed their lead. Language here is not merely a record of reality but the mold that reality is poured into, solidifying while you watch. The breath slows as this recognition lands, creating a brief pause where the next phrase has not yet appeared. In that pause, before the words return, what version of reality is actually waiting to be spoken? You begin to notice how certain words carry a weight that feels heavier than their surface meaning, as if they arrive already charged. There is a slight shiver of tension when you hear familiar terms echo internally, because they seem to do something rather than simply say something. Language starts to feel less like communication and more like action, shaping response before reflection can intervene. The mind steadies itself by treating this as normal, because questioning it would require slowing down. If words are doing more than describing, what exactly are they doing to you? When you hear the word spelling, the sound lingers for a moment longer than expected, brushing against something half remembered. A quiet unease follows, because the overlap between spelling and spells feels accidental yet precise, like a shadow lining up too perfectly with a doorway. The idea emerges that language may have always carried a performative force, one that acts through repetition and form rather than belief. Your awareness holds this thought gently, noticing how often words seem to produce effects regardless of intention. If meaning can act without your consent, where does that leave your sense of authorship? The structure of grammar begins to feel less innocent as you consider how rules shape what can be said and how it must be arranged. There is tension in realizing that order itself carries authority, guiding thought into permitted paths while making others awkward or unspeakable. Language here resembles a hidden system, where form dictates flow and certain patterns become default realities. The breath steadies as this settles, recognizing that structure always teaches obedience quietly. How much of your thinking follows rules you never agreed to learn? Even the motion of cursive writing carries a strange residue, as if looping letters bind thoughts together in advance. A faint pressure appears behind the eyes when you sense that flow itself can conceal constraint, smoothing over questions with elegance. Language becomes a ritual enacted daily, its power hidden by familiarity rather than secrecy. The mind accepts this with a calm nod, because rituals feel safer when unnamed. What rituals are you performing every time you speak without noticing? As these connections align, the idea of language as disguised magic no longer feels dramatic, only practical. There is a subtle disturbance in realizing that influence works best when it feels ordinary and unremarkable. Words operate as tools of alignment, shaping expectation, emotion, and response long before conscious choice arrives. The echo of earlier phrases returns with new weight, like a mirror reflecting a deeper layer beneath the surface. If the spells are woven into daily speech, when did you last choose the words you live by? You begin to sense how words carry histories beneath their surfaces, like sediment layers pressed into a single sound. A mild tension appears when you realize you rarely question where meanings came from, only how quickly they are used. Etymology functions like a decoder ring, revealing the assumptions quietly installed inside everyday language. The mind pauses here, feeling the weight of inherited meanings settling into place. If you never look beneath the word, whose worldview are you actually speaking? At some point in schooling, you were trained to memorize definitions rather than trace origins, and the shift felt efficient rather than suspicious. There is a faint irritation when you notice how this trained speed discourages curiosity, replacing investigation with acceptance. When roots are hidden, language becomes a closed system, offering answers without showing how they were formed. The body recognizes this pattern as familiar, like a classroom bell signaling when to stop asking. What happens to autonomy when meaning arrives prepackaged and unquestioned? You hear the claim that after the mid-20th century, studying word origins quietly faded, replaced by standardized recall and functional literacy. A psychological rupture opens here, not because the history must be perfect, but because the implication feels personal. If people stop decoding language, they stop noticing how power hides inside phrasing. The breath catches briefly as you sense how easily compliance grows when investigation is removed. Is control more effective when it never needs to announce itself? In a mundane moment, you read a policy, headline, or contract clause and feel its authority without fully understanding why. There is tension in realizing that the force comes not from content alone, but from inherited meanings embedded long before you arrived. Etymology exposes how words carry instructions, not just information, shaping posture and agreement automatically. The mind steadies on this recognition, seeing how often it has nodded along. What agreements have you already signed internally without reading the fine print? Here the responsibility sharpens gently, because awareness cannot be unlearned once felt. There is a quiet power in choosing to investigate the roots of the words you use most, even when it feels inconvenient or slow. This is not rebellion but precision, restoring sight where habit had numbed perception. Let yourself notice today when a familiar word triggers an automatic response, and pause long enough to feel its origin echo inside you. If meaning can be examined rather than inherited, what version of reality becomes available next? You start to hear how ordinary phrases position you without asking, sliding you into roles before intention has time to object. A quiet tension appears when you notice how often your own mouth places you beneath authority through habit alone. Language here behaves like unconscious consent, shaping posture and identity while pretending to be polite agreement. The mind settles uneasily on this insight, sensing how often it has cooperated automatically. How many times have you agreed to less simply by the way you spoke? When you say, "I understand," the phrase passes quickly, yet something subtle happens in the body. There is a slight lowering, a soft submission, because the words frame you as standing under rather than standing alongside. These phrases are not about truth or clarity but about relational position, installing hierarchy through repetition. The breath evens out as this lands, revealing how easily identity is trained through sound. If language sets rank invisibly, where did you learn to place yourself? Certain institutional words carry even heavier gravity, activating obedience before comprehension arrives. A tightening in the shoulders appears when you hear them, because the body recognizes command faster than logic does. Whether or not the roots are literal, the psychological effect is real. Repeated phrasing trains the nervous system to defer, comply, or shrink. This realization stabilizes into a calm clarity, separating effect from explanation. What matters more, where the word came from or what it reliably does to you? In daily exchanges, you notice how quickly conversations tilt once a familiar authority phrase enters the space. There is discomfort in seeing how tone shifts, eye contact softens, and resistance dissolves without force. Language becomes the blade that cuts agency quietly, not through threat but through normalization. The mind holds this without panic, recognizing it as a pattern rather than a trap. If power operates this subtly, how often have you mistaken comfort for choice? For a brief practice today, notice the moment just before you agree, comply, or explain yourself, and feel the word forming behind the breath. Let that pause exist long enough to sense whether the phrase places you below, beside, or within your own center. This is not about confrontation but about regaining position before speech locks it in. The awareness settles gently, restoring balance without drama. If you could choose your position before every sentence, how differently would reality respond? If this is hitting close to home, take a second, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me. You begin to notice how your inner dialogue runs constantly, narrating effort, desire, and urgency even when nothing is happening. A low-grade tension lives in the body when these phrases repeat, because they signal strain before action ever begins. Self-talk is not motivational decoration but a set of instructions the nervous system follows literally. The mind rests on this recognition, sensing how often it has spoken itself into contraction. What happens when the body listens more closely to implication than intention? When the phrase, "I'm trying," appears, it carries a quiet exhaustion with it, as if the outcome has already been postponed. There is a subtle sag in energy because the word rehearses effort without arrival, movement without completion. Language here programs expectation, training the system to remain in process rather than resolution. The breath evens out as you see how often this phrase has accompanied stalled momentum. If your words rehearse delay, how could your body learn completion? "I want" and "I need" arrive with sharper edges, activating urgency and lack in the chest almost immediately. The tension tightens because these words announce absence, signaling that something essential is missing right now. The nervous system responds to that signal with stress chemistry, not because the goal is wrong, but because the framing declares emergency. Awareness steadies as this pattern becomes visible, separating desire from depletion. How often has longing been mislabeled as scarcity? In ordinary moments, you hear these phrases slip out while checking messages, paying bills, or planning the week. There is discomfort in realizing how quickly the body reacts, shoulders tightening or breath shortening in response to familiar wording. Language acts as a rehearsal space where stress is practiced long before circumstances demand it. The mind settles into a quieter register, recognizing how often it has trained itself into alarm. If the rehearsal changed, would the performance follow? Responsibility surfaces here without blame, because the choice of words is a choice of state. There is calm power in realizing that changing phrasing changes physiology, not magically, but mechanically. When language shifts from lack to agency, the nervous system receives a different set of instructions. Let this land as a simple truth rather than a demand. If your words are teaching your body how to live, what lesson are they repeating tonight? You begin to sense how sound itself moves through you, not as meaning but as vibration touching tissue and breath. A quiet tension arises when you realize your body reacts before thought interprets, tightening or softening as tones pass through it. Words function here as frequency technology, carrying patterns that organize or disrupt internal coherence. The breath steadies when you feel how often your system has responded without needing belief. This recognition settles as a grounded observation rather than a mystical leap. The image of water responding to words appears, simple and unsettling in its clarity. There is friction in knowing that while some experiments are debated, the nervous system still reacts to tone, rhythm, and repetition every time. Biology does not wait for proof to respond, it answers stimulus with chemistry and posture immediately. Your awareness rests on this, noticing how certain phrases accelerate the pulse while others slow it. The body already knows what the mind still argues about. You remember watching sand arrange itself into patterns under sound, shapes forming where chaos once lay. A faint pressure lifts as you see the analogy clearly, because vibration organizes matter whether meaning is attached or not. Language, spoken repeatedly, creates internal patterns of tension or coherence in much the same way. The mind settles, recognizing how often it has dismissed this because it sounded symbolic rather than mechanical. If patterns form without belief, what patterns have your daily words been shaping? In an ordinary moment, you hear your own voice aloud and notice how your chest responds to its tone. There is a subtle tightening or release that happens faster than interpretation, like water responding to a dropped stone. This is not magic but feedback, the body adjusting to the frequencies it is bathed in most often. Awareness stabilizes here, separating spectacle from mechanism. The practical effect remains even when the story around it is removed. When you speak gently, slowly, or with certainty, your breath organizes and the body follows. A quiet calm replaces strain because coherence feels safer than chaos at a cellular level. Words become less about belief and more about environment, the atmosphere your nervous system must live inside. Let this understanding rest without urgency, like water returning to stillness after motion. If your speech creates the internal climate you inhabit, what kind of weather are you living in? You begin to notice how some forms of speech feel expansive while others feel compressed, as if certain words allow the mind to stand upright and others make it hunch inward. A subtle tension emerges when you realize this difference is not accidental but patterned across social lines. Language functions as a quiet divider, distributing precision and ambiguity unevenly while pretending to be neutral. The mind steadies on this observation, sensing how vocabulary itself can shape access to power. Who benefits when expression is narrowed without being noticed? You hear how reduced language shortens attention, flattening nuance into slogans, reactions, or symbols that vanish as quickly as they appear. There is discomfort in seeing how simplified speech makes complex thought feel tiring or unnecessary. When vocabulary shrinks, the range of internal movement shrinks with it, limiting what can be imagined or negotiated. The body registers this as a subtle dullness, a fog that settles without announcing itself. What possibilities disappear when words lose their edges? In contrast, You notice how those trained in precise language move differently through conversations and decisions. A quiet pressure arises when you see how clarity grants leverage, not through dominance but through definition. Language here becomes a tool of navigation, allowing thought to articulate boundaries, intentions, and consequences cleanly. The mind rests on this distinction, recognizing that precision is not elitism but capacity. Why would anyone willingly surrender a tool that sharp? Children absorb this long before choice appears, mirroring the speech they hear modeled as normal. There is a tightening in the chest when you realize how early this shaping occurs, embedding limits that feel like personality rather than conditioning. The vocabulary offered becomes the ceiling of articulation, shaping how questions are asked or avoided. Awareness stabilizes as responsibility surfaces gently, without accusation. What was modeled to you as normal speech, and what was never shown? Here the realization sharpens into agency, because language can be reclaimed consciously. There is calm power in choosing to expand words deliberately, restoring depth where it was thinned. This is not about imitation of elites but about restoring full access to thought itself. The breath settles as this lands, like a posture correcting naturally when strain is released. If language determines how far the mind can move, how far are you willing to let yours travel? You start to feel how every sentence you repeat acts less like commentary and more like a quiet agreement signed in the background. A subtle tension appears when you realize how often identity is declared casually, locking direction without intention. Language here behaves like a contract with reality, not because the universe listens, but because the nervous system organizes behavior to match what is stated. The mind settles on this insight, sensing how repetition solidifies into trajectory. What contracts have you been renewing daily without reading them? When you say, "I am," the words land with unusual weight, anchoring identity before circumstance has time to argue. There is a tightening when you notice how often this phrase is followed by limitation rather than possibility. Identity statements function as coordinates, guiding perception and action toward whatever follows them. The breath steadies as this becomes clear, revealing how consistency matters more than intensity. If identity sets direction, how carefully have you been setting it? You hear claims about observation shaping outcome, and while the explanations vary, the effect feels familiar. A quiet pressure lifts as you recognize that attention plus language collapses options into habits, not through magic but through repetition. What you repeatedly name becomes what you repeatedly notice, and what you notice becomes what you reinforce. The body relaxes into this logic because it matches lived experience. Is manifestation simply the discipline of naming wisely? For a brief internal practice, notice one sentence you use often to describe yourself and feel how your posture responds to it. Let the phrase dissolve for a moment, replacing it silently with one that implies agency rather than lack, and observe the shift in breath. This is not affirmation but calibration, adjusting the internal compass rather than forcing belief. The awareness settles gently, recognizing change as mechanical rather than dramatic. What direction does your body move when the words change? As evening approaches, you sense how speech echoes forward, shaping tomorrow before it arrives. There is calm responsibility in realizing that language is a daily vote, cast whether you mean to or not. Choosing words deliberately becomes an act of sovereignty, reclaiming authorship over direction rather than outcome. Let this understanding rest like a signed document placed carefully on the table. If reality responds to consistency rather than hope, what will you sign with your words tonight? You begin to notice how certain phrases repeat around you so often they fade into the background, like a constant hum you no longer register. A quiet tension surfaces when you realize repetition does not inform, it conditions, shaping expectation through familiarity rather than evidence. Language here functions as mass spellcasting, not mystical but psychological, narrowing perception through rhythm and frequency. The mind steadies as this clicks, recognizing how normalization works without persuasion. What becomes unquestionable simply because it is heard everywhere? Headlines, slogans, and alerts use the same emotional palette, leaning on fear, urgency, and authority to bypass reflection. There is a subtle contraction in the body when these phrases appear, because fear shortens time and collapses nuance. Repetition trains acceptance, not through logic but through exhaustion, until resistance feels unnecessary or even unsafe. Awareness holds this calmly, seeing the pattern without being pulled into it. When fear frames the message, how much thinking actually happens? You recall moments when a single phrase reshaped behavior across entire populations almost overnight. A psychological rupture opens here as you see how words act like rituals, repeated until they feel like reality itself. Propaganda does not convince, it familiarizes, shrinking the range of imaginable responses. The breath catches briefly as you recognize how easily identity adjusts under constant linguistic pressure. At what point does adaptation become surrender? In daily life, you notice how conversations echo media language unconsciously, borrowing phrases without examining their implications. There is discomfort in seeing how quickly these borrowed words steer emotion, posture, and compliance. Language becomes the carrier wave through which behavior is synchronized, not by force but by mimicry. The mind settles into clarity, distinguishing information from programming. If you speak the language handed to you, whose agenda are you extending? Here a quiet shield forms, not through denial but through awareness. There is steady power in noticing when a phrase attempts to install fear, urgency, or inevitability, and internally refusing the framing before it takes root. This is not rebellion but sovereignty, choosing what meanings are allowed inside. Let this awareness land like a firm stance rather than a raised voice. If control enters through repetition, what happens when you stop repeating it? You begin to feel how the phrase, "I am," lands differently from any other statement, settling into the body before thought evaluates it. A quiet tension appears because this phrase feels final, as if it seals something rather than describing it. Identity language operates as a point of collapse, where possibility narrows into habit through repetition. The breath steadies as you sense how often this command has been spoken without care. If identity is declared before experience unfolds, what space is left for change? Words like trying, someday, and hoping float just outside the present, never fully touching the ground. There is a subtle drain in energy when you notice how these terms postpone arrival, keeping intention suspended. Language here behaves like an observation device, locking attention onto delay rather than movement. The mind settles into this clarity, recognizing how easily power is canceled by phrasing alone. How often has momentum dissolved at the level of words? You hear references to observation shaping outcome, and the symbolism aligns with lived experience more than theory. A psychological shift occurs when you see that repeated naming trains attention, and attention trains behavior until it hardens into reality. Consciousness does not need to bend physics to collapse possibility, it only needs to repeat a frame long enough. The body accepts this quietly, because it recognizes the pattern from its own history. Is the observer simply the one who keeps looking the same way? In ordinary mornings, the first sentence spoken internally sets the tone before the world is even checked. There is tension in realizing how quickly identity locks in before choice has a chance to intervene. Language becomes the lens through which the day is observed, shaping reaction, opportunity, and memory in advance. The awareness rests here, seeing how small statements produce long arcs. What if the day is decided before the phone is ever touched? As this understanding consolidates, a deeper unease and clarity arrive together. There is responsibility in knowing that words do not follow reality but lead it through attention and repetition. Identity is not discovered but rehearsed, spoken into familiarity until it feels inevitable. The breath slows as the pattern closes in on itself, like a doorway narrowing behind you. If the next words you speak define what can exist, what are you about to make real? You have seen how language moves first, shaping posture, breath, and expectation before events ever arrive. This awareness is not meant to make you careful, but precise, returning authorship to the point where identity is quietly installed. Notice the words you allow to pass unchecked today, slow them down, and choose one sentence you will no longer repeat. If speech has been steering your life invisibly, what happens when you finally take the wheel? From here, the work becomes lived rather than understood, practiced in ordinary moments where language usually runs on autopilot. Listen for the phrases that drain energy, replace them with ones that hold agency, and observe the shift without forcing belief. Let this be an experiment carried into your mornings, conversations, and inner commentary, not a rule but a discipline of attention. As this unfolds, are you ready to explore what happens when the voice inside you is no longer inherited, but consciously chosen in the next awakening?